welcome back to Food Prep Guide. I have a quick canning tip for you today. Word of advice, somewhat a word of warning. I have been canning up lots of meals in jars. As you know, we have a Meals in Jars cookbook coming out very soon. If you have not signed up for the wait list for that, it's down in the description box below. But one of those jars, I was picking out a meal to serve my family recently, and I pulled one of the jars off the shelf and it immediately made me question its safety. And I follow safety guidelines when I'm canning, and so that doesn't happen very often. But even when we quote unquote do all the right things, we still need to be vigilant about inspecting the jar when we take it off the shelf and before we serve it. So I have the jar here with me. I'm going to bring it up close to you, and we're going to go into detail about what is making me question this jar's safety. We're going to look at some things like bubbles. We're going to talk about siphoning. We're going to talk about a recall recently. And I'm just going to go into detail about what is particularly wrong with this jar. And then I'm going to have a completely safe jar that also has some somewhat similar characteristics as the bad jar. And we're going to compare and contrast and see, why is this one making me question? I'm going to throw it away. And why is this one safe? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. In case you haven't heard, we have a Meals in Jars canning cookbook coming soon, and in the description box of this video you will find a link to the landing page for that. You can sign up on the wait list to be notified of its release, and when you do, you'll be automatically entered into our giveaway where we will choose one winner to win a free copy of the cookbook. If you're watching this video at a later date, it's possible the cookbook is already available. If that's the case, you'll be able to access that book in the same link in that same description box. If you're new here, we invite you to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming tutorials on canning, cooking, food storage, and gardening. Okay, here is my jar. It is the vegetarian pot pie jar, and I'm going to bring you up close and show you what is in particular making me question this jar. And it is, I'm going to kind of try to make it focus here. These foamy looking bubbles at the top, can you see those? My light is really kind of making it difficult to see. Okay, I turned down the light just a little bit, so hopefully you might be able to see it a little bit better. But there's a line of bubbles around the top of the jar. They have a bit of a foamy appearance, and that is making me immediately question its safety. Now, let's talk about siphoning. You can see I have some liquid loss here. Now, when I took this jar out of the canner, I had siphoning immediately, but it wasn't that much. I had lost about this much liquid. This was the original liquid line, and I have lost that much sitting on the shelf. And what I think happened with that is that the potatoes down here at the bottom, it's got I think 1 or 1.5, maybe even 2 cups of potatoes. I can't remember what the recipe was, but I think the potatoes just kind of soaked up some of that liquid, but I did have pretty significant siphoning when I took it out. So I am not concerned about the siphoning. The general guideline for canning safety is that you can have up to 50% liquid loss and still have safe food. So if half of your jar still has liquid in it, and I mean, as long as all the canning steps were followed, safely to begin with, then you don't have to worry about siphoning. Siphoning is just a normal process of canning. There are things we can do to kind of avoid it or decrease the chances of it happening, but sometimes you do all the right things and siphoning still happens. It happens to me. It happens to every canner. So this amount of liquid loss, totally fine. What in the world is causing these bubbles? I do not know for sure, but I have a theory. And it's just all over the rim. It's not even in one section. It is all over the jar, all at the top of the jar. Bubbles in canned foods is typically a bad sign. Before I go into my theory about what may be wrong with this, I do want to compare and contrast bubbles in another jar that I know is totally fine. Because bubbles, like I just said, is generally not a good sign, but there is a case where it's okay, and that is going to be in sauces like your applesauce, your tomato sauce, your spaghetti sauce, especially if you use a blender to blend up your tomatoes or your apples. An immersion blender, a regular blender, a food processor. If you are spinning that product before it goes into the jar, you're essentially aerating that product, and it's totally normal to have little tiny bubbles in there, despite the fact that we debubble. We do debubble every jar, just as that's just a canning guideline to get as much air out of the jar as possible. But when you are essentially aerating that fruit or vegetable, trapped air bubbles is unavoidable. So I want to show you, let me find one. Okay, here's some. Here's a cluster of 3 little air bubbles. You see that right there? There's some more. Here's one. See that one right there? When I shake the jar, the bubbles do not rush to the top, number 1. And also, there's no foaming bubbles up at the top of the jar. All of the bubbles, excuse me, all of the bubbles are down inside the sauce. They're not gathering and fizzling up towards the top of the jar. These bubbles are fine. These bubbles are no concern at all. Unlike these bubbles, where they are congregating at the top of the jar, and they do have somewhat of a foam-like appearance, and that is making me question. So here's my theory. I have the benefit of filming a lot of the canning projects that I do since we're here on YouTube. So I was able to go back and watch the footage of myself making this jar, and I wanted to review that footage and see, did I do something wrong? Did I mess up? Was I just talking to the camera and, you know, it just slipped my mind to do something? I didn't do any major mistake. The one thing I did do was, this was the jar, y'all may have remembered, where I used extra carrots, more than the recipe called for. Now, if you are a seasoned canner and you are familiar with canning guidelines, safety, you know that it is okay to use some more vegetables than what the recipe calls for, as long as your canning processing time is high enough to cover the longest vegetable processing time needed, which in this case was the potatoes. A quarts of potatoes have to can for 90 minutes, which is why we canned this quart for 90 minutes. So it's totally fine. The carrots, using a little bit of extra carrots, it doesn't affect the density of the food. It didn't affect how long I needed to process the food. So just for the simple fact that I used more carrots than what is called for is not going to make this jar unsafe. Here's my theory. I canned these jars when we were in the middle of a nationwide recall on carrots. It was from Grimway Farms, and when I was shopping for carrots for this recipe, I knew that that was happening, that recall was happening, and so I read news articles about it, went to the FDA, read some stuff there. Not FDA, yeah, FDA. And what I found, it was only the organic carrots from Grimway Farms that was affected. And so when I went to the store, I bought the non-organic kind. And not only was I assured that buying the non-organic was fine, but when I went to shop for the stores already knew about the recall. So they already had all of the other organics that were, all of the other carrots, the organic carrots that were affected, they already had those removed from the shelves. So the fact that this particular brand, this particular non-organic variety was still on the shelf also gave me some reassurance that these carrots are okay and not affected by the recall. But I know that it was supposed to only affect organic carrots, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that maybe a few batches here and there were also affected. I believe the recall was for E. coli specifically, but it may have been for other things in addition to the E. coli. I don't know really in depth on how E. coli presents itself inside of a canned good. I don't know if there's any visual signs that it's there. I don't know. I feel like the E. coli bacteria is killed at the pressure canning temperatures, which is the whole reason we pressure can to begin with, is to get our inner temperatures high enough under pressure to kill off the bacteria that could be in there, including botulism spores. So I don't even know if that's a thing. But that's the only thing I can think of, since this was a heavily carrot recipe and those carrots were maybe under recall. They weren't supposed to be non-organic, you know, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility to think that it could be, I could have gotten a bad batch of carrots. So I am throwing this jar out. I am not going to consume this. I'm not going to feed this to my family. Now, I will say that there is a high possibility that this food is fine, but in the canning world, there is a phrase that when in doubt, throw it out. And when you go to inspect your canned goods, if there is anything fishy about that jar, to me, it's not worth potentially making my family sick. I know it's a lot of hard work went into that jar, but it's not worth it. I will just simply throw it out. Now, I do want to mention, just in case anyone else has chickens like we do, and you might be in the habit of throwing food scraps to your chickens, I will do a whole bunch of scraps like that just when I'm cooking throughout the day, and even sometimes like canned food like this. But when you are questioning it, it's not even going to be safe for your chickens. I have heard horror stories of canners who tossed their questionable canned goods out into the yard, and their chickens ate them, and they woke up the next morning and all of them were dead. So it's not even safe for animals. So this will go in the trash so that no one can get in touch with it. But that's just the rule that I follow. When in doubt, throw it out. We have a whole video dedicated to the, I think it's top 8 signs that your canned food has gone bad. And I will link that in the description box below. But in general, I follow the eye test, smell test, and eye test, yeah, visual. Just visually looking and seeing what does it look like when you open the jar, how did the seal open, what kind of spurt noise, vacuum seal release noise did I hear when I opened the jar, smell it, everything looks fine. I've gotten pretty lax on that though as I have canned, because I know that I am following canning safety guidelines. But this is a very important reminder to me, and one that I wanted to pass on to everyone else, that we just don't want to get lax on inspecting our canned goods before we serve them up and cook them up in the kitchen, okay? I hope that was helpful to y'all. Remember, not all bubbles are bad. We do have a video on that as well, about bubbles in tomato sauce, applesauce, stuff like that. That bubble, totally fine, nothing wrong with this jar of tomato sauce. So I will link that in the description box below as well, if you would like a more a detailed and longer video discussion on just bubbles. That will be linked in the description box as well too. Okay, y'all, I hope that was helpful to you, and we will see you next time. Bye.